It has been and still is a good tradition in all the navies of the world to name their ships after military figures. Here is the French frigate Chevalier Paul, named after an admiral from the 17th century. The early Federal Navy also maintained this tradition and gave its warships the names of former members of past armies. There were the three guided missile destroyers Mulders, named after the Luftwaffe Colonel Werner Mulders, Rommel named after Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and Lütjens named after Admiral Günther Lütjens, who was fleet chief during the sinking of his flagship Bismarck on the 27th. May 1941, who shared the fate of another 2,105 fallen sailors. The Federal Navy also had until around the mid-1960s a number of training frigates which bore the names of significant German military leaders. Gneisenau, named after the Prussian Field Marshal August Neidhart von Gneisenau. Scharnhorst, named after the Prussian general and chief of staff Gerhard von Scharnhorst. Hipper, named after the Chief of Staff of the Reconnaissance Unit of the German High Seas Fleet in the Battle of Jutland, Admiral Franz von Hipper. Scheer, named after the commander of the German High Seas Fleet in the Battle of Jutland, Admiral Reinhard Scheer. Raouli, named after the Brandenburg General Director of the Navy, Benjamin Raouli, and Brahmi, named after Karl Rudolf Brahmi, the commander of the German Confederation's Imperial Fleet from 1849 to 1853. Of course, there was also a training ship called Deutschland, which was in service from 1863 to 1890. Actually, the first frigate of the F-123 class was also supposed to be named Deutschland, but that idea was abandoned. Instead, from then on, all larger warships of the German Navy were named after cities, like the frigate Brandenburg here. And then there was also the training frigate Graf Spee in the Bundesmarine from 1959 to 1964, named after the chief of the East Asia Squadron of the Imperial Navy, Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. The predecessor of the West German frigate had been the armored ship of the Kriegsmarine, Graf Spee. It was on the 13th. On December 13th, 1939, under the command of Captain Hans Langsdorff, it was heavily damaged in battle against 3 British cruisers off Uruguay. And on the 17th of December 1939, it was scuttled by its own crew in the Rio de la Plata off Montevideo. Afterwards, Captain Hans Langsdorff took his own life with this pistol in Buenos Aires. In 1917, Countess Margaret von Spee, the widow of Count Spee, christened a large cruiser of the Mackensen class with the name Graf Spee. All tough, after its launch, it was never completed and was scrapped in 1923. But who was this person, whom each the Imperial Navy, Kriegsmarine, and Federal Navy named one of their ships after? Maximilian Reichskraft von Spee was born on June the 22nd, 1861 in Copenhagen, and he entered the Imperial Navy on April 23, 1878 at the age of 17. During his 34 years of service, he had an outstanding career. After serving as a commanding officer on board, he also fled as Chief of Staff of the North Sea Naval Station, as well as Rear Admiral of the reconnaissance ships and the 3rd Squadron. His last peacetime assignment was from the 4th of December 1912. He became the chief of the cruiser squadron in East Asia, and in 1913 he was promoted to Vice Admiral. Count Spee is described as a person with high human, military, and naval qualities, and was respected by both his superiors and soldiers. For 2 years, he served as Admiral of the East Asia Squadron. Afterwards, in 1914, he was now intended for another assignment. However, when the First World War broke out in August, Count Spee had to remain at the head of his cruiser squadron for the time being. However, he was aware of his position far from Germany and of the need for an accurate assessment of the situation. That, in all likelihood, Great Britain would declare war on the German Empire, as they did on the 4th of August 1914, and that Japan, which had already shown hostility earlier, would follow this example. However, since the German naval radio station on Yap, the main island of a small island group in the Western Pacific that had belonged to the German Empire since 1898, was destroyed by the British Navy after being taken over by Japan. Count Spee was completely without any connection to Germany and thus entirely on his own. But in order to be able to participate in the war operations carried out by Germany, he had led his squadron, which had been reinforced by several smaller ships, to the west coast of South America. From there, he then separated from 2 ships. The light cruiser Nuremberg was sent back to Honolulu. The Blue Route, where he was supposed to locate the main force of the Royal Navy, and the light cruiser Emden, Green Route, into the Indian Ocean, for independent commerce raiding, but this was also meant to help conceal the movements of the East Asia Squadron. In any case, the Emden under corvette captain Karl von Müller soon became the most successful German cruiser in overseas waters, and then it became one of the most famous warships of the Imperial Navy. During her independent commerce raiding operations, she set oil tanks on fire and, within 2 months, sank or captured 23 enemy merchant ships and 2 warships. But each time, all the sailors on board the enemy ships were brought to safety. However, on November 9, 1914, the Emden was also engaged in a naval battle and sunk by the Australian cruiser Sydney, which was far superior to her in every respect. This happened near the Cocos Islands, which belonged to the outer territory of Australia. 136 German sailors had fallen. The remaining 197 were taken prisoner by the end of the 18. Meanwhile, Count Spee had managed to go unnoticed. With his flagship, the armored cruiser Scharnhorst, and captain at sea Felix Schultz, the armored cruiser Gneisenau, and captain at sea Julius Merker, as well as the small cruiser Nürnberg, which had rejoined the squadron, and captain at sea Karl von Schönberg. They covered 11,000 nautical miles unnoticed. At the Easter Islands, the small cruiser Leipzig and frigate captain Johannes Hohn, as well as the small cruiser Dresden and frigate captain Fritz Ludecker, had joined his squadron. In this area, the squadron destroyed enemy submarine cables with axes like these, blew up enemy radio stations, and resupplied themselves with coal and provisions from German freighters on the high seas. But then, on November 1st, 1914, the German cruiser squadron off the Chilean coast encountered an English naval force of roughly equal strength under Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock. This led to the naval battle at Coronel, which only turned out as it did, thanks to the intensive gunnery training demanded by Graf Spee and his strategy. By positioning themselves east of the British warships shortly before sunset so that the British had to look into the evening glow, they succeeded in sinking the English armored cruisers Monmouth and Good Hope. The British light cruiser Glasgow and the auxiliary cruiser Otranto managed to escape with damage, as shown here on the map in the lower left. While on the German side there were only 3 wounded, the Royal Navy suffered 1,660 casualties, including Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock. Britain still honors those naval heroes until today. For his victory at Coronel Weiss, Admiral Graf Spee was awarded the 2 Iron Crosses. More important, however, was that now the eastern Pacific and the west coast of South America, between Panama and Cape Horn, were in German hands. But this also meant that British prestige had been seriously damaged. because the naval battle at Coronel had shown the world that the British Navy was not invincible, and that it could even be defeated by the navy of the continental power Germany. Because of that, Count Spee was also aware that the British Navy would not accept this defeat and would do everything possible to find and destroy him. His fears quickly became reality, because now the British Admiralty sent the Chief of War Staff, Admiral Frederick Doveton Sturdy, with the battle cruisers Invincible and Inflexible to hunt down Count Spee. For the German Admiral's squadron, shown here with the German commanders involved in the Battle of Coronel, there were now two options. He could have had his ships and crews interned in Chile, or, as long as he was able and had enough ammunition, he could continue to engage the enemy naval forces in this theater of war, and then, when the opportunity arose, attempt to break through and return home. Count Spee had chosen the latter. First, he had headed for Valparaiso. As you can see in this picture, with 3 Chilean warships in the background, the squadron then left this Chilean port city on November the 13th, heading toward the Gulf of Pinas, south of the Chilean Taitao Peninsula, where it took on 17,000 tons of coal from 4 German freighters. Then the squadron, now consisting of the 5 cruisers and the supply ships Baden, Santa Isabel, and Seydlitz, set out for Cape Horn on November 26, 1914. It was rounded during the night of December 1st to 2nd. However, due to the stormy weather, part of the coal had to be thrown overboard, which, together with the increased coal consumption caused by the rough seas, led to a significant loss of fuel. These concerns were temporarily alleviated when the small cruiser Leipzig was able to capture the Canadian 4-masted, full-rigged ship Drummer. During the next 3 days, the supply ships took on the 2,500 tons of high-quality Cardiff coal, and then the 4-masted bark was sunk. As mentioned, this temporarily alleviated the concerns about the lack of coal. But these 3 days would still have fateful consequences for the German East Asia Squadron. Because even though Graf Spee's armored cruisers had used up 42% of their 21-centimeter ammunition in the Battle of Coronel, and there was no hope for resupply, he decided, against the advice of his naval officers, especially the commander of the Gneisenau, Captain at sea Merker, to proceed. Before a possible return home, they carried out a surprise landing operation on the British Port Stanley on December 8th. The aim was to destroy the telegraph station, take over the coal supplies, or to destroy them and capture the British governor, Sir William Layman Allardyce. But what Graf Spee couldn't have known was, here you can see him and the other commanders in the so-called war room of the Scharnhorst, that at Port Stanley, the 2 British battle cruisers had just arrived to take on coal. They had also met here with the 5th Cruiser Squadron under Rear Admiral Archibald Stoddart. Thus, Admiral Sturdy's squadron consisted of his battle cruisers, Inflexible and Invisible. Additionally, it included the armored cruisers Carnarvon, Cornwall, and Kent, the light cruisers Glasgow and Bristol, as well as the auxiliary cruiser Mercedonia. The old battleship Canopus, equipped with 4 30.5 centimeter guns, had been grounded by the British in November to secure the important supply base. When, on the morning of the 18th, December, as the Gneisenau and the small cruiser Nürnberg, leading the squadron, approached Stanley ahead of the landing corps, a lookout on the Gneisenau spotted the masts of the British battleships. However, since they were still taking on coal and were therefore relatively unable to fight, an immediate attack could very well have been successful, but this fact was not known to Count Spee. When the British admiral received word of the approaching German squadron, he immediately ordered the coaling operation to be stopped. At the same time, the Kent, which was on standby, set out, and the Canopus, which had been grounded for harbor defense, opened fire on the Gneisenau and Nuremberg with her 12-inch guns, although the shots fell short. But with that, Count Spee knew that his planned landing operation had failed. Around 10 o'clock on the 1st of December, the entire British squadron had left Port Stanley and confronted Spee's approaching East Asia squadron. After Count Spee realized the imbalance between the two squadrons, he released the heavily outmatched small cruisers from his fleet formation. This was to at least give them a chance to escape against the overwhelming force. But this decision came too late, as the British armored cruisers Kent and Cornwall, and soon after the Glasgow, had already set out to pursue the weak German ships. With the opening fire of the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau on the Invincible, the naval battle at the Falkland Islands had begun. In the background, you can see the German ships. But despite 23 hits, the strong armor of the battle cruiser was not impressed. Admiral Surrey also didn't take any risks, and, although he was far superior, he had his battle cruisers move out of the range of the German guns. From there, he returned fire from such a great distance that the German armored cruisers, barely visible through the smoke on the horizon, could at times only respond with their two heavy gun turrets. But after 3 hours of fighting, the uneven battle was over. After suffering heavy hits and high losses, the Scharnhorst had moved in for one last unsuccessful torpedo attack on the Breton. But her damage had been too severe. At 4:17 p.m., the German flagship sank with her entire crew, including Admiral Graf Spee. By 5:30 p.m., the fate of the second German armored cruiser, Gneisenau, was also sealed. After most of the crew had already fallen and the ship was a scene of complete devastation, the remaining crew decided to scuttle the Gneisenau themselves by opening the valves. Almost all German sailors perished in the process, including the Admiral's younger son, Lieutenant at Sea Heinrich von Spee, at the age of 21. And when the light cruiser Nuremberg was overtaken and shot to pieces by the Kent, his older brother Otto, also a lieutenant at sea, was among the fallen. Later, British sailors reported that some German sailors, standing by a boat hook on the aft deck of the sinking cruiser Nuremberg, had defiantly waved the Imperial Navy flag toward the enemy, until they too were swept away by the sea, swallowed up. Except for the Dresden, which was initially able to escape, all the other light cruisers had been sunk. In total, 6 German warships were sunk in the naval battle at the Falkland Islands. In addition to the Admiral and his 2 sons, another 2,200 sailors were killed, 860 on the Scharnhorst, 598 on the Gneisenau, 327 on the Nuremberg, and 315 on the Leipzig. The British Navy had to mourn 10 dead and 19 wounded. After such a painful defeat for the Imperial Navy, speculation began on the German side. Why did Count Spee come up with the idea of attacking Port Stanley? And how it was possible that the two enemy squadrons could apparently meet by chance on the vast ocean? Even Kaiser Wilhelm II, here in the uniform of a Grand Admiral who had a special affection for the Imperial Navy and had been a great supporter of it, had left a handwritten note on the official battle report. It remains a mystery what prompted Spee to attack the Falkland Islands. For 11 years, it was assumed that it was the German Admiralty that had inspired Spee to attack, based on information from the German radio station in Valparaiso, which reported that Port Stanley was free of Royal Navy warships. But in 1925, the real reason emerged. At that time, former German naval colonel an intelligence agent, Franz von Rintelen, had conducted an interview with Admiral William Reginald Hall, the director of the Naval Intelligence Division of the Admiralty. Here in 1934, in the conversation with Rintelen, it was confirmed that Spee's squadron had essentially been lured to the British battlecruisers by a false radio message. This false message had been sent in the German naval code, which had been broken by British cryptographers, and had led Graf Spee to attack what he thought was the undefended Port Stanley with all its important supplies. Just like in World War II, think Bletchley Park and Enigma, this time too, British intelligence was miles ahead of the Germans. But a certain German bad military habit also contributed to this. Repeatedly handling radio messages carelessly, and not adhering to secrecy regulations or radio discipline. I have already mentioned that only the light cruiser Dresden managed to get out of range of the British guns. But the fate of the Dresden was also sealed 3 months later, on March the 14th, 1915, near the Juan Fernandez Islands. There, the Dresden, handicapped by severe damage to its engines, had hidden in a bay on Robinson Crusoe Island in neutral Chilean waters, where frigate captain Fritz Lüdecke wanted to have himself and his crew interned. But just as with Spee, this time too the British Navy intercepted a radio message from the Dresden, indicating that it wanted to take on coal at a location identified by the listening specialists. So then the British knew they would find the Dresden at Robinson Crusoe Island. But even though Captain Lüdecke had signaled to the British that his disabled ship was no longer a combatant, and he, as seen in the last picture before the destruction of the Dresden, had the white flag raised, the British light cruiser Glasgow and the armored cruiser Kent, with a clear intention of violating the laws of naval warfare, entered Chilean territorial waters and opened fire. 8 German sailors died, and 29 were wounded, some seriously. However, Captain Lüdecke had managed to prepare the Dresden for scuttling and thereby save the crew who had been brought ashore. Even today, the dark shadow near Robinson Crusoe Island marks the position of the wreck. Until today, there are still a number of places and streets in Germany that commemorate the Imperial Admiral Count Maximilian von Spee. However, as early as 1990, the Berlin district of Tiergarten, who's surprised by that, renamed Speestraße to Hiroshima-Straße. And in Dortmund, which has been led by the Social Democratic Party for as long as anyone can remember, had its particularly suitable city archive made in 2014 the unholy decision to designate Speestraße, located in the Nordstadt, with its approximately 73.5% residents with a migration background, as politically charged, because streets were named after the Count during the Nazi era. While in Dortmund, there are still streets named after Thälmann and Karl Liebknecht to this day, which, according to the historically uneducated interpretation of those representatives of the Long March through the institutions who have reached their destructive goal, are of course still considered to be completely politically unburdened. But at that time, there was still no majority for a renaming. At the end of 2022, the District Council of Innenstadt Nord, led by the Green District Mayor Heiner Rosenbaum, third from the left in the picture of the Green District Executive Committee, decided with a large majority to rename Speestraße to Dr. Safi Ali Straße. Who knows, maybe an Admiral Graf Spee, if he were still alive today, would strongly object to having a street named after him there of all places. But on that matter, it's best to remain silent for the singer's courtesy.